Before we begin, I would just like to start us in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for the ability to come together with people in the room and people virtually to see what your hand is doing here in the churches in Utah and Idaho. Lord, I pray that as we give this presentation on risk management, Lord, that your hand be on us, that we remind ourselves that while there is risk in this world because this world has fallen, that we need not worry at the end of the day because you're sovereign. And your plans will be carried out and your mission will be carried out. And even if something happens to our church body, you are still in control at the end of the day. So while we talk about risk management, we talk about what we can do to make sure that we lower the level of risk for people, that even when risk does occur, we need not worry because you love us and you are sovereign. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, we're starting off today looking at just that term. What is risk management? The series, and including this session today, is really essentially to help you become aware of the legal aspects of what it is and what can occur with the church. So risk management is an area that is of popular concern, shall we say. But risk management is the administrative effort to reduce the chance of liability. And liability itself, we need to understand a term. It's the legal responsibility to enter or to either compensate someone or perform a required action, or I might say desist from an action after someone has been harmed. In other words, liability is the opportunity for a person to sue or file a claim and be compensated. So that's what liability entails. Now, there are aspects to risk management. We're going to be covering each of these aspects in the course of today's session. The first one is simply policy. Second is training. The third is supervision. And the fourth is records. Now, each of these has a purpose. Each of these has an effect. And so it's important that you be aware of these four elements when you are addressing your own actions, how you're conducting things, your activities. Be aware of policy, training, supervision, and records. And with that, Brian will talk to you about church liability.
So before we get into the four categories and to reduce the risk management, it's good to understand where a church is liable. So the church is going to be liable for the actions of the trustee or board director, depending on how which term you're choosing to use, its officer and its members. But keep in mind, it's only in their official capacity. In other words, these people must be acting on behalf of the church in order to be held liable, in order to hold your church liable. For there to be any action or any liability, there must be either a breach or a failure to act. In other words, there must be either some sort of wrong act, a commission in legal terms, or a failure to act, or an omission in legal terms. So for example, a breach would be in which something like there's mismanagement of funds. The person is actively trying to mismanage funds. That is an action that they are taking. An omission might be a puddle that's on the floor of your building that you don't know about, but should have known about because the drinking fountain is always leaking and someone slips and falls. You didn't commit the action to make them fall, but you didn't take proper care to make sure that that person was safe. So a breach will occur when there's willful misconduct. In other words, the person is acting, an intentional action, or if it's grossly negligent. And usually where you're going to see breaches come up is usually it's under gross negligence or it's an intentional act. And examples of this again are slip and falls, financial mismanagement, or even abuse. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is important to note that this liability that we're discussing right now for churches is only when someone is acting on behalf of the church. If someone is not acting on behalf of the church, they are liable for their own actions. So for example, if the pastor is driving home after the service, they're in their own car, under their own insurance, and they get in an accident. The pastor is personally liable for that accident. It is not the church's liability. Another example would likely be if the pastor acts way outside of the scope. So for example, if they are engaging in a conversation at church and they get terribly angry and they strike the person. Not only is this a criminal act, but it's also an intentional act that would go beyond the scope of the pastoral duties. And they would probably be held personally liable. Doesn't mean the church will not get sued in that instance, but the pastor would be personally liable in that case.
You may be familiar with the term tort. That's a legal term, and it refers to this area of negligence in particular. And as Brian has emphasized, and it's clear to understand, it starts with there being a duty to be safe, a duty to be reasonable, a duty to do the right thing. And it's when that duty is breached that a tort occurs, and when there can be liability attached with that. I might note that in terms of the negligence standard, if it's a board member or like a trustee or they're acting as an officer, the standard will be gross. But if it's something other than their acting, it may be simple negligence. You have to just be aware that there will be a possibility of liability out of that. So with that in mind, then we're going to look at the very first element. Now you may recall there were 4 elements: policies, training, supervision, and records. Now policies will be the first area, and it's simply this: a policy is a document which a church has adopted, and that policy details how things are to be done, who has what responsibilities, who has what authorities. They are more detailed and more specific than would be bylaws. Bylaws more or less set up the organizational aspect of it, but the details of policy would occur. For example, the church may say there shall be a Sunday school, but the policies of how you handle Sunday school or handle an event or whatever would be more detailed. So the important thing here is the church has to be aware of the need to have policies. And as attorneys, one of the things we can never overstress is have them in writing. Have them in writing. Make sure that people understand what those policies are. And we're not going to get into all the policies that you can do or need to do, but just be aware you will have to look at them, develop policies and procedures to fulfill that policy. The next thing with it, and this is ground rock essential, follow your own policy. Many churches, many organizations, maybe even the federal government has policies and will not necessarily follow those. And that's where you can run into problems. And in terms of liability, if you haven't followed your own policy, that can be an open door for a liability judgment. When you have a policy, review it periodically, and that can depend on the type of policy and your circumstances, but review it and update it regularly, whether that's every year or every 5 years. Make sure you review the policy. A simple example could be that you have a policy for a van, a church van, but you don't have a church van. So you really don't need a policy for a van, or if you had it when you started the policy, it's no longer necessary. But you want to make sure that it's up to date in terms of how you are doing and what you're capable of doing. And then the next element here is simply disclosing that, making it known to the members and volunteers. Now, policies and how they're adopted will depend a lot on your bylaws and how you manage your business decisions. But you want to make sure that policies are made known to the members. That also means that copies of all policies will be available for them to read. And the same for volunteers. Just make sure that there are ways to make those known. The added thing here that we've put in, and I think it's important, most churches have, if they don't have, they should have insurance. Talk with your insurance carrier or the company. Make sure they're aware of your policies. One, they can help you by telling you what they think that is good or not good in insurance terms. But if you're going to have any what we call extra church activities, camping trips or whatever. It could be a variety of activities. Make sure you let your company know about that and what your policy is with respect to it. So with that in mind, the next element will be training, and Brian will talk with you about that.
Before we go into training, I just want to make a quick plug for one of our previous conversations that we had, and that is on policies and procedures, which is on the UISBC website at the link that I was showing before we started our presentation. So if you have more questions on policies and procedures, I recommend you go there and watch that video. And then if you have even more questions, feel free to give us a call. We're more than willing to help walk through good policies and procedures and help you draft them as well. So let's move on to training. So once you have your policies and procedures in place, it's important to make sure that everyone knows the policies and procedures and is trained. So for example, you're going to want to make sure that people are trained in first aid if they're dealing with children. If a child gets hurt while they're in the classroom or on the playground, the person needs to know how to give basic first aid. And so in that instance, you want to make sure that you're hiring qualified people who can give the training. And I would recommend that you record that who attended those trainings. And if there's a certificate of completion, that you have a copy of that certificate on record. And the reason why you want a qualified instructor is because you want to make sure that the person is properly trained. For example, you do not want me as your lawyer trying to train you on how to do CPR. Although I do have my certification in CPR, I'm probably still not the best person to be training you because I do not practice giving CPR all the time. So you want to bring in someone who is skilled in this area and who uses that skill set to do the trainings. And the reason for making sure that you are recording who's attending in the materials is simply so that way you have a record of this later, which we'll talk about later. Another good reason for training is it develops skills and confidence. You want to make sure that your people know how to use the skills to help somebody. Again, going back to the first aid example, does the person know how to apply a Band-Aid? What type of Band-Aid should you be applying? These are all questions that can happen quickly if you're not careful. But if they're trained and they feel confident in the skill set that they're using, it will not be, the chances of panicking will be diminished. When you're hiring a trainer, you want to make sure that they're going to train to a specific standard. Again, going back to my example of me as an attorney. Do I know how to give CPR? Yes. Am I going to be able to train to the standard and levels in which an EMS person could do so? No. So you want to make sure that the standards that they are training to meet the standards that we would expect of somebody giving the presentation, right? So example, again, you do not want me being the one teaching you how to do CPR. I would not be able to teach you to the standard of someone who is an EMT. And then rinse and repeat. The thing is that we do forget things over time. It is important to have trainings, whether you use yearly or every other year on issues. Again, I'll keep using first aid as an example, and specifically CPR. The standards for CPR change. When I was first taught how to give CPR, it was you want to make sure that you're giving 2 breaths and 15 compressions. Now they're finding that it's better just to keep giving compressions because we're trying to keep the blood moving. This is why it's important to rinse and repeat and make sure we keep training people, because the standards change, the implementations change, and you want to make sure you're staying up to date for not only in case you ever have an emergency, but so that way these people, your people again, have confidence in administering any skills that you need them to have.
The next element is that of training, and not training. I'll be getting to back up. The next part I wanted to mention about training is simply this: it applies to all ministries and all areas of activities in the church, and that can be whether it's an administrative area, whether it's in a teaching with classes, whether it's activities, taking youth on a trip. These policies can apply to across the board to anything that you are engaged in. But with that, then there also is an expectation. And that's one of the things the policy does is and as Brian has indicated, it talks about developing skills and confidence, but it makes sure that it's clear what is expected of a person acting as a teacher or youth leader or whatever. So expectations are an important part of policy, and those expectations may change over a period of time. So that's why we want you to regularly review your policies. Now, the next component here that we're talking about would be supervision and oversight. So you have a policy which basically says this is what you're to do. Training is where you've told them how to do it. Supervision or oversight means you're monitoring, you're watching it, you're trying to assure that it's being followed. And there are a lot of examples where it can happen that it's not followed. One is if you have an active youth group and you have outings, and one of the youth, senior boy, 17 years old, he has a car, and you tell him, go ahead and drive the group. Your policy, whether it's insurance policy or other policy, may say, no, that's not a good idea. And what you don't want to have happen then is next week, the same boy drives a car with a full load of kids from the church. So you've got to make sure that things are being followed, ensure the procedures are being followed. You've got the training that is talked about, the standards are maintained. And when you say oversight, you want to make sure what the training is. And as Brian's indicated already, it's important to keep track. There'll be more discussion on that coming up here. But the idea is making sure that in the supervision, the training did occur. Now, I can use an example of a church we're familiar with. It just had a VBS. They have an Awareness program, and they're very good, very on top of the training of what's expected of the workers, the leaders, and what they are to do. That purpose includes what's the mission of the church and how is this going about the fulfillment of that mission. So it's very, very good to do that. And as you come down, look at the list that we have on the slide, ensuring the standards are maintained, ensure that incidents are recorded. You don't want to just wash over or just ignore something that may have a serious impact or may pop its head up later. You want to make sure that that's covered. And the last thing, and I think it's an important factor, the supervisor or overseer does not need to be the pastor. If you are in a church, for instance, that has a Sunday school department, then you will have likely a director or superintendent, someone in charge of that department. They have a responsibility to be supervising. It could be any other activity, anything else going on with the church, any ministry. The responsibility to oversee and supervise does not start at the top. It starts within that. And there is, of course, self-supervision. But one of the things with pastors, we have to understand that the pastor's role goes beyond just these corporate things. That job is a spiritual job, ecclesiastical job. There's a ministry that's involved with that. And you don't want to have that pastor so involved with overseeing the running of the church that his primary role suffers as a result. So, but he needs to know what's going on in the church. Overall, then, supervision, oversight is an important component.
Essentially, if you think about it in the same way when Moses' father-in-law was talking to Moses about how he was setting up the governance and of the Israelites, Moses was handling everything, was being run ragged, and his father-in-law stepped in and said, you can't do it all. It is impossible. And he empowered other people to take care of things take care of the smaller matters. And then as the matter grew bigger and bigger, it worked its way up to Moses. It's similar to this, right? The pastor is over everything, is overseeing everything. They're overseeing the church body, they're overseeing the pulpit, they're overseeing ministries. It's impossible for you to do it all. So it's important for as pastors to be able to find the people that you trust, to empower them to be supervisors in that aspect, train them. So that way they can oversee the ministries that you think are necessary for your church. And To this end, we'll move on to records. Why do we keep records? We keep records because one, insurance companies like them, and two, courts like them too. They help us know what happened. So what's important with a record is make sure that you were recording what actually occurred. Don't lie. As an attorney, I hate bad facts. In fact, I hate them so much that I am tempted to lie all the time. It's wrong, and I know I'm not supposed to do it, but it's tempting. It's very, very tempting. Why? Because I don't want to look bad. I don't want to look foolish. Name the reason for why you lie. And that's exactly what I, as an attorney, am feeling whenever I receive bad facts. That being said, it's very important that I do not lie. I don't lie, one, because biblically we're called to tell the truth. And two, I don't lie because 9 times out of 10, you're going to get caught. And when you get caught, the punishment is always worse. But essentially, we don't lie because we're going to stand before God at some point, and God is going to say, you lied in this instance. And that's sinful. So even though we're going to be tempted to lie, I encourage you not to lie on these reports, even if it does make it look bad. Telling the truth will always be better. Making a record, again, it complies with governmental rules, regulations, and laws, right? If you're having an incident, and the police need to get involved, the police are going to ask you to make a record. So that's why it's important to know what the government is going to require of you in making these records. This should be part of your policies and procedures, that anytime there's an incident, that you're going to make a record of it. And then that, again, this goes back to the training aspects and the oversight to make sure that those records are actually made. Part of record keeping is also knowing what you need to do to make sure you stay up on your exemptions. If you're not filing the proper records with the state, your exemptions may lapse, and you may have to be paying a tax bill that you don't really want to be paying. Church grounds are going for hundreds of thousands of dollars these days. You do not want to be paying taxes on that when you are exempt. So make sure that you are staying up on your exemptions and the proper paperwork you need to remain exempt. And finally, I highly recommend you use forms. Make some sort of form that is consistent that you can always give out, whether that's just a simple incident form or a release of liability, consent form, whatever that form may be. Feel free to make forms, make minor adjustments when needed, but have them at the ready so that way people have some sort of uniformity when filling out these reports.
As we look at all of these 4 components, it's hard for us to tell you one is more important than the other because they're all significant and important. A quick metaphor for this, I guess, or a sample what it could be. You are sued as a church, and we'll say that you are on the stand. The plaintiff has called you to the stand, and he says, Pastor, or whoever it is, Pastor, does your church have a policy on this? And your answer could be yes, no. If you say yes, he'll say, what is it? Can I look at it? If you say no, he'll say, get out your checkbook. Same thing on training. Do you have training? Yes or no. What is it? What is it comprised of? Who took it, and so forth? If no, get out your checkbook. You can see where I'm going with each of these elements. That's why each of these are so important. And records are one way to verify where you are and what you're doing and have done. And part of what we need to throw in here with this also is the safekeeping of records. Where do you keep your records, and particularly if they are confidential? And that's a whole another topic. But at the same time, just be aware that it's important to, where you keep the records, are they secure? Who has access to those? And so that gets back into your policies. What do your policies say? So I just think it's important that you have that. And where things come up, it can happen. For instance, I'm not so sure if it does as much as it used to, but with bank accounts. A church could not open a bank account without a record of a certificate of authorization or approval by the church body. Just make sure that you have the records necessary to meet those things. All right, well, moving on then. All right, we've talked a little bit about the 4 elements of risk management and what liability is. So if liability is focused on money, where does the money come from to pay off a judgment? Well, most churches don't have the money to pay. For instance, someone's killed in an accident of some kind, either at the church or on a church trip or whatever, and it's a $300,000 judgment or more. Does the church have $300,000 in the bank to handle that? A lot don't. But that's where insurance comes in. And you can get insurance, and there are various types of insurance to have, and they cover a variety of things. Notwithstanding what you see on television and all the insurance commercials, there are some basics that you need to be aware of. And we'll talk about some of those as we go along here, but consider as for insurance, liabilities, one of the things we're talking about, the general liability. That would be someone slips and falls, as mentioned. Someone is in an accident. A child is playing a game at Awanas and gets hurt. You have an activity, VBS outside, somebody gets hurt. Liability goes beyond just personal injury. It can also involve damage to their property, to what they have. You've done something that you've driven into their car, or your whatever. The church liability has the 2 aspects of liability and property. Property can also be insurance for your own property, the church's property, so that if there's a windstorm, if there's fire, there's leakage, whatever it is, that your property has some protection. Then there's auto insurance if you have an automobile. The automobile insurance also, that could be a van, a bus, whatever. But within this context, and as Brian's mentioned, there'll be situations where the pastor, another church officer, trustee, somebody is driving somewhere on church business. And one of the questions is the church going to be liable for anything that they do? And the key there is, were they essentially on church business doing this? And so do you have coverage for that? Their auto insurance may not be enough. And even if they do have insurance, that doesn't mean that the church won't get sued. So you need to have some sort of coverage there. Financial, one of the things we're dealing with here is mismanagement or embezzlement. And we must tell you that more often than not, there is embezzlement that goes on in churches across the country. And there are many lawsuits that come out dealing with a treasurer or somebody, even pastors, who have mishandled or even taken funds. Abuse, that whole area there, that's becoming a greater area of concern. And the awareness that churches have now that they did not have before, that you need to have a policy in place and do things the right way. And in the abuse area, because it's so notorious now, it's so well known, you better be sure you have insurance that addresses abuse in a variety of ways. Whether it's abuse against children, as to incidents with children, or sexual abuse, or any of the other kinds of abuse that can occur. You want to be sure you have things covered. Missions is another area we mentioned here. If you are engaged in missions, that is having a team going out on a mission trip, whether it's locally or internationally, you need to be looking at what are the possible liability issues that can come up. And we need to have some kind of insurance on that. Classic example, is classic in our mind, is a team that was sent over from a church here in America, went over to Southeast Asia, and one of the youth that was on that was bitten by a bug over there and had to go through extensive hospitalization. I don't think the person died, but it took a long time for healing. And he had all kinds of questions, but the question was in court, should that church, and particularly the church leader who put that mission trip together and recruited the mission people, should he have known that that bug was over there and could cause harm to the point that it did? Now, we have to ask ourselves, how are we supposed to know all those things? Well, you may not know all those, but that's for careful investigation beforehand, knowing who has been over there before or what to expect, even talking to the State Department, what to expect over there. But talk to your insurance company and say, what are you going to cover? And that might even include, for example, the extraction or transportation of that victim, that patient, from Southeast Asia back to the United States or to Guam or wherever it would take to get the treatment. So you want to be dealing with an insurance company that is aware of and handles mission type projects. And there's many more areas that can be covered under the heading of missions. Okay, so we look over here, the next column here is basically talk with your agent, make sure you understand coverage conditions, training, inspections, resource guidelines, creating records. You can see there's some repetition of some of the elements we're talking about here, but coverage conditions. You know, you can get a policy. When you do, you're talking to, you talk to an agent, may even be a member of your church, could be anybody, a friend, a neighbor, whatever, and they're going to talk to you about this coverage. And you'll get a quote, and it'll say ABC, here's what's covered, and here's the amount of money per incident or whatever. But the real thing is the policy itself, when you get that policy and all the declarations and the conditions that are incorporated into the policy, they're not set out in the quotes. You have to look at what is actually covered, because definitions is the name of the game, and that's what we run into so much. That's a large part of what the law is about. What does this mean? What's the definition of this term? So make sure you have a clear understanding of what the coverage is, and feel free to ask even the oddest questions or detailed questions to get that information, to know what are the actual coverages that we're dealing with here. Training, part of that is making sure that you want to take the training, which we talked about, but you want the insurance agent and the insurance company to say, here's what we specifically recommend, or even make a condition, here's what we want you to have training in. And here are the resources, and look down, here are some resources and guidelines we can provide for you. An example would be Brotherhood Mutual, which is used by a lot of churches, or Church Mutual, which a lot of churches use. They have a lot of resources. They've been down this track, and basically what they want is for you to have a clean operation where there's no liability, and therefore they don't have to pay out any damages. And I mean, they've got good motives too, but it's insurance companies don't make money by giving it away. So they're going to do what they can to provide you the information to avoid claims or reduce claims that may come in. Creating records, Brian's already talked about the importance of that. Make sure you have records. And when you're talking with your agent, as much as you'd like to trust them, tell them, put that in a letter so we have it and I can show it to our board of trustees or our church or have it on record. And if they don't send you a letter, you send them a letter saying, here's what we talked about, here's what I understood. If I misunderstand this, please correct me. Okay. So you have those things. On claims, okay, a whole process. Who in the church is to handle the claim? Who receives the claim? Who gets sued? Okay, in terms of some of this, you have a resident agent, or a registered agent, I should say, with the state. That's the person who's named to receive summons, complaint and summons, official notices. That person may receive the complaint, but what do they do with it? If a lawsuit's filed, what do they do with it? But you may have an insurance claim that doesn't involve litigation. It may be your claim that you're making for damage. So the question is, who handles that? Our recommendation is the trustees are a good body to start with. To say, all right, to look into it, see what we've got, what happened, what's the claim going to be, keep records, build the file on it, details. One of the things we run into frequently is somebody will say, well, you know, there were 5 witnesses here and we saw the accident, and you talk to witness 1, and then you say witness 2, you say, well, I don't need to talk to the others because they saw the same thing number 1 did. Did they? Not necessarily. And so you want to be sure that you keep a record of all witnesses, all statements, and there's more to coming up on that. But you want to know who you contact, not just the agent that you bought the policy from, but the insurance company itself. Who do you deal with there? And it's always a good idea to develop a relationship with them, at least that you can feel confident in calling. Well, that's a little bit more lengthy component here, but the notion is, if you're going to have insurance, and we're talking risk management here, it could cover natural causes, because one of the risk management things is to make sure your roof's in place or whatever, that you're safe. And if there is a heavy storm, whatever, you're prepared for that insurance wise. So with that in mind, we'll move on to the next factor.
All right, so what do you do when an incident occurs? The first thing you want to do is you want to assess the situation. Depending on what happens, if it's just a roof collapse, it's still technically an incident. No one's harmed. Then you can move on to the next thing, which is probably going to be get in touch with your insurance company. But if someone is hurt, how bad is it? Are we talking, did little Bobby get a scrape on his knee and you got the Band-Aids for it? Or are we talking a broken arm and we probably need to call 911, take the child to the hospital? Right. So it's important to assess the situation, because it's going to tell you what you need to do. It's going to tell you how you need to act. Then the next part is attend to any, in this case, it'd be a victim, right? Again, if little Bobby is the one who's hurt, attend to little Bobby, make sure that you stop the bleeding, or that you have provided the level of first aid that you're able to provide. If there are no victims, and then that's okay. Then you just move on to the next part, which is the reporting. But we want to make sure that someone who is harmed is being cared for. So the next part is report. You want to report anything to the supervisor or the leaders. If you are the supervisor, who's supervising you? Are you the deacon of your church and you need to tell the pastor of your church? You can handle the situation and then talk to your superior. But it's important to make sure that anyone who is over you knows what is going on. Once you've reported, it's time to create the incident report. This is where you grab that form that we discussed earlier and you write down what happened. One little caveat to this is that if we're talking about an incident of abuse, I recommend you call the police and let the police bring in their incident reports, and you write on their incident reports. So that way they have the record. They may allow you to take it on your incident report records, but clarify that with them first. Once you've written your report, or well, actually while you're writing your reports, see if anybody else saw what happened and get a witness statement from them. Again, the caveat here is, if we're talking abuse, talk to the police, let them handle it, or DHS or DCFS, whoever it is that is going to be responsible for handling the abuse. Let them be the ones who handle any witnesses. Let them be the ones who document the reports. Work with them to make sure that everything is being documented properly. But it's important to get witness statements. And it's important to get them while they're fresh. Our memories are notorious for failing. And so it's important to write things down immediately or as soon as you possibly can. The next part is inform anybody who needs to know what's going on. If a child is harmed or hurt, tell the parents. Don't hide it from the parents. They will find out. And when they find out, they will be angry with you that you hid it. So tell them what happened. Let them know that you took steps to remedy the problem. Again, if it's just a little scrape on the playground, you put a Band-Aid on it. 9 times out of 10, they won't be upset. If they are upset, at least you documented it. And lastly, follow up. A lot of times what happens is an incident has happened and you take care of it and then you get distracted and you go on to do something else. But I think it's important to follow up, especially if we're talking about a person who's been hurt. Following up helps keep that bond between you and your congregant, make sure that they are being cared for. Also, it's important to follow up on any claims with the insurance companies. The amount of paperwork that goes into making a claim with the insurance company, sometimes things fall through the cracks. So it's important to follow up with them and make sure that they have everything that they need to process any claims. It's the same thing with anything else, really. People are fallible and mistakes happen. So it's important just to make sure that they have everything that they need. That's why it's important to follow up.
You know, when you're looking at incidents come in all sizes and shapes, and in fact, apply to a lot of different things. But the idea, amongst anything else, is what we've talked about before. Have a policy in place. Try to look at what areas of concern or what possible incidents might happen, and develop your policies to incorporate just what Brian's been sharing here. Have a good policy in place. One of the things, when you look at the very first one on the assess the situation and call 911, if you have any first aid courses or Red Cross handbooks and all, that's the very first thing they emphasize. Assess what's happened, look at it. So I think that's healthy and good. On the child abuse in particular, any sexual abuse things, we have some materials online with the state at the tab there, and particularly there's one that's a guide for pastors. What is a pastor to do? What should a pastor do when something comes up? And a large part of these things deal with reporting and who reports. So take a look at those guidelines, because that's important that it be done the correct way. And this is the other footnote I'd like to add to this, is simply that, particularly in criminal cases or abuse cases, as a church, you need to be careful that you don't do anything that either creates an issue for investigations by governmental authorities like police department, fire department. You're not the professional investigators. They are. You need to know what's going on, but you don't want to do anything that interferes with or impairs their investigation. So just be mindful of that. So if it gets to that area, some of those things I mentioned are in those guidelines. But just be aware that, yeah, you can investigate and make us back to what do you do with the records? Who has access to those? That kind of thing. Okay, next slide. What to do if you're sued. Okay. The one thing you don't want to do is to maybe say, okay, I got sued, I resign. That's not going to cure it. But the thought here is this: you look at the type, and as you see here, we've outlined some, and the first one is the tort claim, which has already been talked with you about, that there being a duty. We have a duty to be safe, to have a reasonable place, particularly if you have the public coming on the property, or let alone your own members, or guests, or children. There's a duty to be reasonable, and you just have to follow that. Example: do you, in wintertime, do you take the ice, remove the ice from the entryway to the church? Yeah, it's a good idea to do that. If you don't, then somebody can slip and fall. So you have those things here. But so there's a breach, and that breach is a proximate cause of injury, then that's when a suit can be filed. That you should have anticipated that something could happen here. You did not. As a result, somebody was hurt. Okay, so next thing comes up is court. What's involved with the court? Now, you have reason to be concerned about what will go on with the court, but you don't have to be so overwhelmed by it that you're afraid to get up in the morning or do anything. The court is there to help. There are rules, there are procedures, but if you're sued, the best recommendation is don't try to represent yourself. It's one thing to be a small claims court, but if you're talking about personal injuries or things like that, don't try to represent yourself. But he's looked down. A complaint will be filed, and there will be other things that will occur, but an answer will be required. So if you get sued, Johnny, what is it? 20 days, I think it is, isn't it?
You have 21 days.
21 days. That you must reply, otherwise you can be deemed to be in default. So you'll have to answer within that time, and an answer is a formal document. The complaint says, First Baptist Church, you did this. Your answer is, no, we did not, or whatever the answer is, but you respond. Discovery is the next step, and that's where both sides are inquiring, trying to find out what are all the facts, what are all the implications. One example there simply is someone slipped and fell. All right, the discovery would be, all right, did they really get injured? Did they go to a doctor? Who was the doctor, or the ER, whoever it was? Were they taken, transported over by an ambulance? You want to get those facts, understand what happened, because it's one thing to say, and a typical one can be backlash or whiplash in a car. And there are often people who file a claim for whiplash. And I remember one case, right, the passengers in the car didn't even know they were in an accident. And so there is spurious as far as the claim. Discovery helps find those facts out, what's essential. And based on those facts, they may be able to settle the case before it goes to trial. Trial is where you're going into the court, either with a jury or without a jury. And that's where evidence is presented by both sides, arguments are presented by both sides. And then whoever, whether it's a jury or the judge, they're going to make a decision. And that's the verdict or judgment. When a judgment's entered, that judgment says, church, you don't owe anything, or church, here's how much you owe, or here's what you've got to do. So if you get sued, one of the things to do, call your UISBC legal team. If nothing else, we can give you kind of a rundown of what you ought to do at that point, what you need to be thinking of, maybe even make recommendations for attorneys to handle it. But if a complaint is received by the church, who should handle it? Our suggestion is that that's a role that the trustees should take on right away. That's not a pastor job. That's not a departmental job, the superintendent job. Trustees are for that. Now, what they do with it, they're going to have to investigate. They're going to have to understand what the background is. They're going to have to see what the options are. They're going to have to make sure that everybody who needs to know, including the pastor. Contact the insurance company. Yes. Now, one of the things you need to be sure of in your policy and your coverage is what legal defense provisions are in there. Some policies are very good about that, and they'll say if you're sued, we will provide your legal defense. Legal defense or court costs can be the bigger part of any judgment. So you'd like that, but you also need to know they have a limit on that. If they're going to have a legal defense, do they pick the attorney or do you pick the attorney? And they're going to have certain say-so in terms of any settlement that's agreed upon. So anyway, with that in mind, then, is working with the legal team, and you do not take lawsuits lightly. Unfortunately, it happens frequently. A church can be sued, and they just file it away. They say, "Oh, we're a church. We don't have anything to worry about. Our insurance will take care of it." And that suit can end up in some very heavy costs in terms of money, costs in terms of reputation, confidence within the church. There's a lot that can happen with it. Do not ignore a lawsuit or even a demand letter that comes. If a demand letter comes, and that happens frequently, an attorney says, well, my client was hurt. We're going to file a claim. We demand satisfaction. Don't just file that. That's the start. That's not the actual lawsuit, but it's the prelude to it. So with these things in mind, don't take a lawsuit too lightly. On the other hand, don't let it control the life of the church or destroy the church. And you have to be careful with how much is said in church, because if it involves an individual within the church, if that individual is suing the church, you have to be careful there. What's the Christian's duty? And you get into a lot of things there. But you don't, the other thing is, this is if you're sued, but it also may be called as a witness. That'll be another topic. But you may be called as a witness, so you have to be looking at what can I say or not say. Anyway, that's what to do if you're sued.
And I just want to reiterate, this is why the UISBC legal team is here. If you do find yourself in a lawsuit, please give us a call. we're happy to walk through it with you. We're happy to provide as much guidance as we can. If we're able, we're happy to represent. There will probably be some questions in there that we need to get through before we can make that determination. But we also know 3 or 4 Christian attorneys in the area that we are happy to refer you out to. So please contact us. Let us be your helper getting through a secular system so that way you can focus on what God has called you to do, as to be a pastor. So with that, let's talk about Good Samaritan laws. We all know the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is the person who was going down the road and saw the injured man on the road and stopped to help him. And we as Christians, we're called to be to take care of our neighbors. What does the law say about that, though? Well, thankfully, the law says that a Good Samaritan is a person who provides emergency care to someone who is harmed. In other words, you are able to provide care to someone who needs it. It's usually during an emergency, and you're doing it in good faith. You just want to help the person. You're not there to try and make money off the person. You're not there trying to take the person for a ride or anything like that. You are there to help him because that's what God has called you to do. You're not liable. So, for example, if you see someone who is in a burning car and you go over and you pull them out of the car, while you're pulling them out of the car, you happen to dislocate their shoulder. You're not liable for that action. You're trying to save that person's life. You're trying to help them. You're doing what God is calling you to do. And the law says you're fine. You are not going to be held liable. There is one caveat to this. And that is if you're acting in a grossly negligent manner. So let's just say instead of a burning car, you come upon a car wreck. The car is straight up and down. And the person's in the car seat, and instead of asking the person if they're, if they're feeling anything, if they're hurt or anything like that, you just go and pull them out of the car. You are being grossly negligent because you don't know what's going on inside that person's body. You don't know if there's a broken bone somewhere. And then when you go to pull them out, that bone now fractures completely and pokes out and they start bleeding. You're being grossly negligent at this point because you went beyond the skill set that you have and beyond what the situation calls for. This may be a tough line to try and toe. I understand that, but just try and keep this in mind that if you feel uncomfortable, if you feel like it is well beyond what you are able to do, it is okay to just call 911 and give as much aid as you possibly can. Do not go into an area where you feel uncomfortable because the likelihood that you do something worse is high. And in that case, you're not going to be covered by the Good Samaritan law. But if you feel that you are comfortable, you know how to render the aid necessary, the law says you will be protected as long as you're providing aid in that emergency. Right. So that is our presentation on risk management. Our next one is going to be on religious liberties. So if you have any questions about churches and religious liberties, or maybe your parishioners and their liberties, feel free to contact us and let us know. We're happy to look at it and talk about it at the next meeting. I expect that we'll probably also be going into a little deeper dive on the Supreme Court's recent case law on religious liberties. If you have any questions about this presentation or any other ones, there's our contact information. Feel free to contact us then. The next presentation will be in September. It'll be the 3rd Thursday in September. I can't think what that day is off the top of my head. It'll be at 2:00. It'll be here at Redeeming Life. It'll also be online. With that, we have a couple minutes if there are any questions.
Any questions, any thoughts? Obviously, there's a whole lot to deal with when you're dealing with law and legal matters. Hopefully, the intent of this seminar will be fruitful for you, and that is just to have the awareness and to be able to approach law without undue anxiety. I want to put it that way, but it's important to be aware of what we've shared with you. So thank you all for those that are here for being here, and those that are online or watching us on the video. Hope it's been helpful.